Mr. Vermeil?
Katie called, raising her hand.
I think I saw a man with a gun outside.
There is no combination of words more perfectly calibrated to turn a teacher's blood to ice. The horror only settled deeper in my chest when I watched my kids go crowding around the windows, chattering excitedly amongst themselves like a shooting star was going by.
I don't see him. Where is he? Oh, he's right there behind the tree. What's he look like? What's he doing?
I couldn't see a thing out there myself. The thick, oppressive blanket of mountain fog that always settled on this school made visibility low in the best of times. All I could see was that endless ocean of trees disappearing into that vast backdrop of white. But I trusted my students and took their reports dead seriously.
Get down!
I finally shouted once I'd worked out the knot in my throat.
Get down under the windows. Don't let him see you.
It was the first time I'd raised my voice at these kids, and that scared them more than the man outside. The room was a cacophony of squeaking chairs and shoved desks as they rushed to huddle under the windows. All the while, my heart was pounding in my ears as I scrambled to pull the Velcro straps over every window that would release the safety shutters. Every instant, I felt certain some homicidal maniac was about to take my head off. I wasn't even just scared to die. I was scared of my students being forced to witness something like that. But I got lucky. Or maybe he had mercy. The only way to reach the headmistress's personal phone was an old-school red telephone that sat on my desk, with a bit of tape reading, "For emergencies only." She'd always been very particular that she'd be called instead of the police in times like these. All I had to do was punch in *66, and she picked up in an instant. I'm embarrassed to imagine what I must have sounded like. The incomprehensible verbal diarrhea of a man who'd never dealt with a situation more deadly than a bicycle crash or a high fever. But luckily, she seemed to parse together exactly what I was getting at, and her stoic, commanding tone silenced my babbling in an instant.
It will be dealt with.
Sirens started blaring all over school like it was about to be leveled by a tornado, or maybe nuclear Armageddon. Under the din, my students all frantically whispered to each other, trying to guess at what was going on. "He's a hunter," was the consensus. That almost calmed me down. If he was just some hunter after the elk and mule deer up here in the Rockies, then no biggie, right? But for some reason, the word hunter seemed to strike the kids with terror. Outside, I heard the screech of tires and 2 rear doors being slammed open. My curiosity piqued. I'd seen that black van labeled security parked in the lot, but never gotten a glimpse inside. Despite all my better judgment, I couldn't resist the tiniest peek under the corner of a shutter. Out of the van poured 2 individuals dressed less like school security guards, and more like the sort of shadowy government agents you'd see in movies. Black suits, shades, and earpieces fitting their perfect comb-overs. I think what I saw them do next was the moment that forever changed me. Forever shattered my delusion that the universe is ultimately a rational and orderly place. The 2 guards checked off their equipment, dropped to all fours, and broke into a sprint. Under other circumstances, it would have been laughable. As it was, it stole my breath away. They ran not even like primates would, but with the exact speed and style of wolves. They must have been going 15 miles per hour minimum. Human bodies just don't work that way. We can't twist our bodies in such a way to allow ourselves to full-bore gallop at that kind of speed. Our joints weren't meant to bend in those directions. They disappeared into the forest like hunting dogs let loose upon the scent of prey. I jumped, and a gasp spread across the room as a gunshot erupted in those woods, and then another. 2 shots total, echoing down the foggy valleys of the mountain, scaring away the crows. Then came the long silence as I held my breath, waiting to see if the nightmare was all over, or just beginning. And then the screaming began. It started as a rumbling murmur, one I couldn't place. Then it acquired peaks and troughs, reaching pitches that managed to strain my ears. At its height, it almost seemed louder than the gunshots had been. It was a man's voice, at least at first, but then it devolved into something that didn't sound human at all, like his vocal cords had been ripped into, and the only sounds he could still produce was to bay like a dying animal. Yet somehow, even that didn't horrify me as much as my students' reactions. They seemed relieved, even laughing amongst themselves, as if this proved we were out of danger. The screams dulled, the sirens disappeared, and my students returned to their seats, staring at me as if expecting me to continue the lesson. It was all so surreal, like something out of a dream. Never before in my life have I been surrounded by people, yet felt so utterly alone. I tried to not break down in front of my own students, but unlike my class, I couldn't just move past what had happened, like it had all been no big deal. So, like a sleepwalking man acting on instinct, I did the first thing I could think of. I called the headmistress again. Her tone was flat, as if nothing was out of the ordinary.
Vermeil.
I wanted to scream at her, but words failed me. I was panting like a dog. I need... I took a drink of water with a shaky hand. I need to know what that was.
Mr. Vermeil, this phone is only to be used in the case of emergencies.
Emergency? This isn't an emergency? There was a shootout outside my classroom. Where's the police? The press?
They're not coming,
she said sternly.
It was all a false alarm. Nobody was hurt.
Nobody was hurt? Are you hearing yourself? I heard a man wail like he was being fed feet first into a meat.
I caught myself, glancing at my class.
If you had heard the things I've heard, you wouldn't be so.
When I employed you under the auspices of the Integration Initiative, it was because I was assured of your dedication to teaching. Surely you recognize the importance of not allowing your class to fall even a day behind the schedule outlined in the syllabus? We cannot allow every minor incident to interfere with their...
Minor incident? Am I the only one here who hasn't lost their mind? If this is what you consider routine, then I don't want to know.
Mr. Vermeil.
She spoke in that tone that always silenced me, as if she commanded my very mind. In the silence, she let out a long sigh. When her voice returned, I couldn't tell if she was leveling with me or humoring me.
Tell you what, I can tell you've had a stressful day. Why don't you take the rest of it off? I can have a substitute fill in while you get some rest. Okay?
I wanted to argue, to scream and shout, but I realized how my students were looking at me. I noticed the tears on my cheeks. Needless to say, I did end up taking the day off. All the while, I agonized over whether to quit. I mean, this was supposed to be my big break, my first real teaching job since the incident a few years back. No more tutoring, no more subbing, getting to head my very own class and create my own lesson plans. I spent the night on the couch watching the news like a hawk. It was all still small-town nonsense. A cat stuck in a tree, a charming local bake sale. Not a word about whatever had happened in that school on the mountainside. The headmistress's gaslighting was starting to work on me. If nobody saw anything wrong with what had happened, then the problem must be me, right? I must have misinterpreted everything. There had to have been some reasonable explanation for what I'd seen and heard. So, the next morning, it was right back to work. The thing is, I've never gotten a good explanation for what the Integration Initiative was. I'd assumed it was some sort of remedial education program. After all, The bulk of my class was severely behind by 5th grade standards. Many needed to learn basic social behaviors, properly expressing their emotions, how to read or write, or even how to speak at all. The Hastings twins, for instance. They were brother and sister, or so I've been told, but near impossible to tell apart. They were both so androgynous, with flawless pale skin totally free of even a single strand of hair, even eyebrows. And they never emoted, never reacted, never even blinked. If you didn't know any better, you'd assume they were mannequins set up at their desks, positioned to stare at me in perfect stillness as I taught. But they were just one of the more extreme examples. A few were more like normal kids, just a little behind. Katie, for instance. When I had a quiet moment in class that day, I noticed her completing a maze in her coloring book with a crayon, and beckoned her over. She sat politely across from me as I composed myself.
Katie, I just wanted to say, you were very brave to speak up yesterday. I know that must have been scary. School is supposed to be a safe place. If you ever need to talk to me about anything, you can just let me know, okay?
She stared at me for a moment, and then said, as casually as you'd discuss the weather,
I hope he suffered.
There was a long silence. I blinked, trying to register what I'd heard.
What? I hope he died real slow.
She continued. Her face was blank, her tone flat.
I hope they took their time with him. I hope that he felt every moment of it.
I wiped the sweat from my brow.
That's not... He was a hunter, Mr. Vermeil. He deserved it.
She insisted.
I hope they hurt him really, really badly. I hope they took him somewhere so they can keep him alive. I hope they're taking away his fingernails and his teeth and his eyes, and he's crying and screaming and... Katie,
I suddenly cut in.
Do you remember how we talked about no-no subjects?
She nodded. After all, we'd spent a lot of time in class discussing what was appropriate to say. I continued, trying to hide the quiver in my voice.
Well, it's not appropriate to talk about, death and suffering.
It was like a switch flipped. In an instant, Katie went right back into just being an ordinary little girl.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Vermeil. I'll remember that for next time.
And just like that, she went right back to her desk, leaving me dazed and stunned like I'd just been punched in the teeth. Even now, I can't help but wonder what she meant by next time. I've learned my lesson. Never talk about what happened to anyone. Never even mention it. And the same goes for any other strange oddities I'm beginning to notice around the school. Like the ditch full of the shed skins of something much larger than any reptile we have up here in Colorado. Or the sound of loud TV static emanating from a bathroom I'm 100% certain had no television. All of it's completely normal to everyone around me, but I can't get it out of my mind. I still check the news and Google obsessively, but can't find the slightest mention of anything off about this place. I did, however, notice something on Facebook. Someone local was asking whether anybody had seen her brother, William, a heavyset man with a big bushy beard who'd gone missing without even his PLB being able to report any location. The post had been made the day after the incident I'd witnessed. Apparently, the last time they'd spoken, William said that he was going out on a hunting trip. It's crazy what the human mind can adapt to, if it's determined enough. I'm not some moron from a horror movie who goes poking his nose into every dark crawl space when he hears a noise. When weird things happen here at school, I don't even offer them a second glance. I'm like a horse with blinders on, always looking ahead, never getting distracted. Something terrible may be going on here behind the scenes,
But I figured that if I just minded my own business and focused on my work, it would never touch me. And that tactic actually worked. Until last night. The moment I got to collapse on the couch at the end of every day was the only thing keeping me going. Once I was home, after all, I was certain I was safe from whatever was going on at work. I'd officially made it through another day. I'd been recuperating from my shift in standard fashion, wasting my life on the couch watching TV and drowning my woes in cheap beer, listening to the rain pounding on my roof, when something suddenly slapped me awake from my drunken stupor. The mention of the name William. I popped up in an instant, staring at the news report as if spellbound. They'd found his hand, and just as Katie had hoped, it was lacking all of its fingernails. Crews were being assembled to scout the woods for the rest of his body, and I prayed their search would lead them to the school. No dice. The hand had been found on a cliffside dozens of miles away. No foul play was suspected, only the ravages of nature. I watched as a forensic scientist speculated that a bear or coyotes either killed him, or consumed his body after death by some other cause, judging by the hints of tooth marks along the... Cut to static. I groaned, missing the days of CRT television, when all you had to do was give it a good smack on the side. I was just about to give up and go grab another beer, when my phone started vibrating in my pocket like mad. One of those doorbell cameras had come with the house here, and it had just buzzed me with 6 notifications back to back. Each read the same: motion detected at front door. I opened the attached photo and found myself dumbfounded. Again, static. It looked exactly like the black and white dominating my TV screen. I didn't even know those cameras could malfunction in that way. I tried to push the growing unease aside as I flicked through the photos, each as distorted as the last. Was a salesman at the door or something? If so, why couldn't I hear any knocking? Then I reached the 6th picture, and gasped with such shock that I dropped my phone. It was an eye. A single eye, red and veiny and bloodshot, piercing through the static, with pupils so dilated that the iris looked almost completely black. It was as if somebody was pressing their face directly against my door camera, just to stare back at me through my own screen, like they were peeking through a keyhole. I stared at my phone on the ground, my heart seizing in my chest. I knew it was just a still photo, but I couldn't help but feel I was locking eyes with something staring back at me. And then I heard crackling in my TV set, and looked up to see it yet again. That very same eye, staring at me from behind that blurring fuzz of static, gazing rapidly around the room before settling to meet my gaze. Its pupils dilated even further, as if excited by the sight of me. And then came a crash and a roar that shook my home. I screamed and fell to the floor, sure some demon was charging towards me. But it was only a bolt of lightning crashing down right beside my door, and my TV screen burned out, every light in my home flickering and dying, a terrible silence and darkness settling upon my living room. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone to flick on its measly little flashlight. I know I was probably just giving away my position, but I just couldn't bear to sit there in that pitch blackness, knowing something could come at me from any angle in the dark. The faint outline of that black eye seemed to have burned itself into my phone screen, but I tried to ignore it. What was I supposed to do? My every primitive instinct was screaming at me to run, like I was some deer in the woods who could sense that the wolves were circling, but how could I escape something I didn't even understand? I hid in my bedroom, with all the superstition of a child who believes hiding under a blanket would protect them from the monster in their closet, staring at my door and clutching my baseball bat like it would do anything. The static returned, outside this time. At first I thought it was just the rain beating against my 2 windows, but then I turned and saw a hint of white light pouring through the glass. I hid just in time. Something unfathomable walked slowly past my bedroom windows, which was doubly concerning, given the fact I was on the second floor. It had the shape of a man, I thought, at least the roughest silhouette, but it was composed entirely of static. Like a TV screen tuned to a dead channel, screeching that static screech and bathing my room in that flickering white light. Even when it passed, I stayed hidden, too scared to move, to breathe, to even think. Tears were streaming down my face. I couldn't stop shaking all over. And then I screamed and jumped to my feet while my bedroom computer screen suddenly blared to life, roaring with the crackle of static that felt like an ice pick working its way into my brain. And from that static, something began to emerge, almost like it was oozing from the computer screen before morphing into a solid shape. I dropped to my knees and covered my ears, screaming and pounding my head. Nothing worked. The static just kept getting louder and louder. There it was, floating above me, something that mockingly disobeyed every rule of God and nature with its very existence. And through the flickering static it was composed of, I caught a glimpse of eyes, thousands of them, all bloodshot and black, staring daggers into my soul. It floated ever closer, its flickering hands reaching out as if ready to settle around my neck. I remembered the way William wailed in the woods. I wondered if I'd sound similar. When its grasp was only an inch away, it froze in its tracks, and I heard a floorboard creak from my bedroom door, which now stood ajar. It was the Hastings twins. They settled their emotionless gaze upon the impossible creature and opened their mouths to speak for the first time. But not in words. Instead, that same horrible static came rumbling up their throats in unison. And the creature crackled back at them as if they were having a conversation. No, an argument. And once it was settled, the thing hovering above me seemed to begrudgingly flicker out, like a TV set being switched off. And the Hastings, too, nodded before disappearing back into the blackness of the hallway. The sound of their footsteps stopping abruptly as if they vanished into the dark itself. The lights flicked back on. Everything went back to normal in an instant. And, once again, I'd been left alone to agonize after having witnessed the impossible. I don't want to go into the self-destructive spiral that was the rest of that night. Crying and dancing and drinking and stumbling around the house like I was commemorating my brush with death. I didn't know what to feel, relieved or horrified or upset. I was crying one moment and laughing the next. But eventually, I finally settled on a single emotion. Anger. My knuckles had almost turned white from how hard I'd been gripping the steering wheel as I tore through that dark and stormy night. I slammed my brakes in front of the school and looked up at it with a swirling drunken hatred. And there, a faint light from the headmistress's office, just like there always was, even long after everyone else had gone home for the night. It was like she never slept. The headmistress was a woman of sunken cheeks and sharp, angular features, harsh yet faultless, like she had not been born but was rather a sculpture chipped out of marble by some Renaissance master. She sat at her dreary candlelit desk in anticipation when I stormed in, as if she'd been expecting me.
"Mr. Vermeil," she greeted. "How may I help you?"
But I'd already seen that familiar, knowing look in her eyes. I scowled at her. "You know why I'm here."
"Perhaps I want to hear it in your own words."
"Don't do that," I snapped at her. It drove me mad, that tone of hers. "You always speak to me like I'm some stupid child. I'm not." You aren't pulling the wool over my eyes anymore.
Her brows raised almost imperceptibly. Did she not even realize she'd been doing that? Or was she just surprised I'd called her out?
My apologies.
She composed herself.
Please, state your piece.
I sat down across from her, collecting my thoughts.
Now, I have put up with a hell of a lot for this job. Not for you, and not for the money. For the kids. But there's something wrong going on here, and I am not going to let you tell me everything's fine and dandy. Not this time.
I jabbed a finger at her.
Every man has his limit, and having some godforsaken thing bursting into my home in the middle of the night? I am already aware of this intrusion, Mr. Vermeil, and you have my sincerest apologies. It is unprecedented in the history of this initiative,
she said in that same even-handed tone.
A parent was upset with the Hunter incident from the other week and somehow deemed you worthy of the blame. The Hastings family is brand new to us, you see, and doesn't quite understand how things work here. I shall see to it that their behavior is corrected.
I slammed a fist against the desk.
A parent? You act like this was some botched PTA meeting. That thing that busted into my house wasn't even human.
I leaned in close.
Headmistress, I'm telling you for the last time, I'm not some useful idiot you can keep in the dark forever. You need to tell me what's going on here, or I walk. Simple as that.
There was a long pause, and in that silence, my mind ran wild. My nerve faltered. Maybe I really am one of those morons from a horror movie, I realized. I'd just waltzed into the headmistress's office all alone and ranted about knowing far too much. If there was some sort of conspiracy going on here, what was stopping her from disappearing me at that very moment? I braced myself for those things in the security uniforms, but instead, the headmistress slowly stood and turned her face to the window with her arms crossed behind her back, watching the raindrops roll down her window.
Do you know the one thing that unites all sentient things, Mr. Vermeil?
I blinked.
No, I don't. The capacity for parental love, she explained. Even penguins will guard and warm their eggs for weeks. Elephants will nurture and rear their calves for over a decade, etc., etc. The love a parent may have for their child is one of the very few ineffable qualities which unites all intelligent species. I know what you're about to say. Yes, there are true monsters out there, of every kind, who neglect or abuse their children. But that is their choice, their own sin. It is not innate to them. In the end, even the darkest devils or most wicked fiends are capable of making the choice to love their own children.
She turned to me, and her gaze was hard and cold. I'd never seen her so on edge.
Now, I want you to imagine that you are of a species that is reviled by all the world, despised and feared by all mankind, considered the stuff of nightmares and urban legend. Perhaps your reputation is well earned. Perhaps you've come to accept your life as a thing of horror, lonely, dreaded, but free.
Her heels clicked against the wood floor as she stepped closer.
But would you not want better for your children? Would you not want them to have, at least,
The option of living in a world that accepts them?
There was a tinge of emotion in her voice, the first I'd ever heard.
That is the Integration Initiative,
she concluded, gesturing to the photos littering the walls of smiling alumni.
We offered you all a truce in a war older than the very mountain we're standing on.
I stared at her, breathless, slowly working up the courage to ask.
We?
As if on cue, lightning struck seemingly just outside her window and lit up the room in its ghostly blue glow. And in that light, the headmistress's shadow appeared to encompass her entire half of the room. It had the shape of something not only inhuman, but which defied all natural laws. Some impossible, cyclopean beast adorned by 1,000 writhing, grasping tentacles. The sort of creature I could imagine pulling entire ships down beneath the sea in some bygone era. But the lightning passed, and all it left was the woman standing before me, staring me dead in the eyes.
Do you understand?
What else could I do but nod? I think it's time to face facts. I really am no different from those morons in horror movies after all. I've been doing a lot of poking my nose where it doesn't belong recently. Recently, I found something interesting in one of the old storage closets. A school photo marked September 2014. There the headmistress was in the back, and I could almost swear I saw a smile there, which I'd previously thought was impossible. But she wasn't the only face I recognized. The little girl in the bottom right. It had to be Katie. Sure, she looked different, blank and robotic and expressionless, like the Hastings were, as if she didn't quite realize how to act human yet. But it had to be her. Sure, it was chronologically impossible, but at this point, I was ready to believe anything. I beckoned her over to have a seat next to me at recess, photo in hand.
Hey, Katie,
I greeted.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to ask if this picture, well, looked familiar to you.
She took one look at the photo, and the biggest grin dawned on her face.
Yeah, I remember that. That was when I first got here.
She held it in her hands and started laughing giddily at the sight of herself looking so stone-faced.
Look at me. I look so goofy. Man, I really had no idea what I was doing back then.
Are you sure? Because this photo, well, it was taken around 10 years ago. According to your file, you would have been a baby when this was taken.
I took a deep breath.
Katie, can I ask you how long you've been going to this school?
She froze. That big grin slowly fell into a frown, her voice lowering.
That's one of the things I'm not supposed to tell you.
She shrugged.
Sorry.
One of the things? Oh, God only knows just how many things even my students know about this school that I'm hopelessly unaware of. I think she could see the despair on my face, because she tried offering something else in recompense.
But I can tell you about him.
She pointed eagerly to the boy standing beside her in the photo. An unassuming lad with dirty blonde hair. I'd never seen him before.
You see him? His name was Elijah. He was my very first friend, ever. He was the headmistress's son. Did you know that?
No, I had no idea. I shook my head. I couldn't imagine that statue of a woman having any family whatsoever.
Wait, was? Can I ask what happened to him?
She looked left and right. before leaning in and whispering furtively in my ear.
Hunters.
And then her friends called her over, and she went right back to chasing them around on the playground, leaving me with a million lingering questions. I'll be honest, I'm not coping with all of this terribly well. I'm already lapsing back into old habits. There's a good reason, after all, that I was fired from my last real job, but the moment I step onto school grounds, I force that smile back on my face. Can't let the kids know that there's anything wrong with old Mr. Vermeil. But I'll be honest, sometimes when I see them, I just can't help but wonder what hides beneath those masks of human skin. Am I doing the right thing here? The social skills I'm teaching were supposed to help them live a normal life. But what if they don't end up choosing that path? What if one of them instead opts to follow in their parents' footsteps and grows up to ply the skills I taught them to lure in human prey, blend into society like a skinwalker, and pick people off one by one? Would that blood be on my hands? It was just as my doubts were at their peak when I received the first text. I was ready to dismiss it as typical spam, but opening it stole my breath away. It was a distant photo of me and Katie, as we'd just been talking, and judging by the angle, it must have been taken from inside the school. I quickly glanced up at the upper windows, but saw no sign of any silhouette staring back at me. Accompanying it was simply the words, "Do you know what she is? Do you really, truly know?" I know I should have blocked the number and immediately contacted the headmistress, but curiosity burned in my chest. I needed to know. So I replied, honestly, that I hadn't the foggiest idea. The next text came almost instantly. "This is the trail of death her mother has left behind in her wake. Study it carefully." Accompanying it were photos of several clippings from old local newspapers from various countries and decades. The first came from the Coterie of Moldavia. An old man complained to the municipality about a terrible buzzing that would echo across his fields for hours at a time. And then the letter stopped, and 3 months later, his body was discovered. Part of the reason it took so long was the complete absence of the stench of deterioration. It was as though he'd been embalmed in his own bed, all fluids drained and organs removed with surgical precision. Cause of death was ruled as exsanguination. The next came from the forests of the Cameroonian highlands. A married couple and their child had gone out on a routine hiking expedition, and they excitedly texted a friend about an immense bird they'd seen that had briefly blotted out the sun. That text was the last time they were ever seen or heard from. A week later, a farmer saw one of their skins fluttering in the breeze. That's it. Just a hollowed, transparent, dried-out set of skin. The farmer had attempted to catch it, but the skin blew away in the wind like discarded wrapping paper and was never recovered. That was just the start. He had a whole laundry list of articles, and poring over them brought tears to my eyes. Oh God, those poor people. What kind of creature could even do that sort of thing? My eyes drifted back to Katie, and I wondered again what laid beneath that disguise. Given the age of that photo, was she even truly a child? For all I know, she could be older than I am. Another text. "This place is playing you for a fool. I know what's really going on here. Meet me in your office." In my dinky little office, nothing. Doubt crept in. Was this some sort of test set up by the headmistress? I was just about to take my leave when suddenly an unfamiliar voice opened up from directly above me.
Mr. Vermeil.
I looked up and saw a face staring down at me from the vent grate in the ceiling. No, not a face. It had all the features of a face. Eyes, ears, nose, smiling mouth. But all arranged in the wrong order, as if plastered wantonly to a discolored lumpen dough ball of flesh. It felt like something out of a dream. I stammered blithely, uselessly. The meat started to push forward, dividing itself into 5 neat sections through the slit in the vent grill like a human body being pushed through a pastry cutter. I watched as tissues and sinew and raw bone dropped to the floor like melting candle wax, melding into a puddle of viscera that grew solid as more biomass gelled with its bulbous form. And in time, that puddle of meat dripping from the ceiling became a man. That smiling face was staring me down again, now in proper arrangement, yet no less deranged. He was handsome, actually, with a fit figure as perfect as his fine gelled hair. Nude, but sexless as a Ken doll. I finally started to run for help, but was stopped by the feeling of something digging into the side of my neck hard enough to draw blood. A jagged bone had jut from his wrist like the point of a spear.
You had your chance to go running away. It's too late now, he whispered. Oh, don't look at me like that. I only wanted to make your acquaintance. I'm a big fan of yours, after all.
A fan?
I've always admired the sort of man willing to betray his own species for a quick buck,
he mocked.
This is nothing personal, really. I'm just here to do my job, just like you. In fact, I was thinking we could work together.
I felt like I might faint. Seeing this, he let me sit down at my desk, albeit with the bone still to my throat.
What are you? Call me Saladin, he answered, in a tone that made it clear it was a pseudonym. And, well, I'd like to say that I'm still human, but that would be a lie, wouldn't it? Used to be, but in my line of work, I've had to find ways to even the playing field.
I noticed the irony of being accused of betraying my species by a man who seemed to have forsaken his altogether. I was reminded of an old Nietzsche quote. Something about he who fights monsters.
Don't you mock me, boy.
His face suddenly soured, as if he'd read my thoughts.
You'd become some breed of horror too, if you'd kept consorting with these unnatural things. When dealing with matters of the occult for long, there are 2 options. Sacrifice your life, or your humanity. There is no third path.
His cocky grin returned.
Just ask poor William.
Just hearing that name was like a punch to the lungs. It knocked the breath from me.
William? You... Of course I knew him. He was one of my feelers. I posted him out here to see if it would lure out the hunting dogs. Prove this place is really as the rumors say. And sure enough.
A streak of rage rose in my chest, battling the fear.
And now, you want me to be your next useful idiot?
I always like a man on the inside,
he taunted.
I only need to kill one child. Just a single one. And this entire initiative will fall apart like a house of playing cards. All the trust the headmistress has built up from the parents, oh, they'd all tear her limb from limb.
He saw the look of horror on my face and laughed. Don't tell me you're actually loyal to her. Did she warn you of the danger you were in when you took this job? Has she done anything to your benefit? Do you really think she cares? Why do you think she even hired you? Just out of the kindness of her heart? She's a big believer in giving second chances to losers with a drinking problem and a rap sheet?
He cackled.
No, it's because you have nobody. You're a loser. All alone. So, in case one of those kids gets the munchies one day, nobody will even notice you're missing. Sure, they may look harmless now, but make no mistake, sooner or later, some of those kids will need to feed. It isn't their fault. It's in their biology, their very being. They were made to prey on people like you and me. And you're planning on helping them blend in. Surround themselves with clueless pedestrians with tasty blood in their veins and meat on their bones. You don't see what's going to happen if this initiative succeeds?
He could see it on my face now. The doubt was creeping in. He grinned, retracting his blade and patting me on the shoulder.
One kid. That's all I need. I just need to get one alone. But they're too smart for that. Always travel in packs. Sleep in that bunker down the mountain. But you? For you, it'd be trivial.
As if on cue, there was a small knock on the door. A big grin crossed over Saladin's face. He held a finger to his lips as he melted through the slats of my closet, disappearing into the darkness just before my door went swinging open. There stood Katie, eyes low. She didn't seem to notice the sweat on my brow, the drop of blood on my neck, or the stupefied expression on my face. Her gaze was on the floor, nervous, as she sat across from me.
Mr. Vermeil, I was thinking, and I know I said I'm not supposed to tell you certain stuff about the school and all, but I think you deserve to hear it, you know? Just don't tell the headmistress what I told you, okay?
My throat felt dry. I could hardly think. Saladin's words echoed in my head. Just one child. But seeing Katie's face reminded me that I didn't need to pick sides in some war I didn't understand. Sitting across from me was a child I'd been tasked with protecting. That was all I needed to know.
Thank you, Katie, but I really think you should go play with your friends, or... It's really no trouble. I don't know why she wants to keep so many secrets from you anyway. It's not like you won't figure it out. Sooner or later.
She didn't notice the droplets of liquid meat that were Saladin blowing in behind her like raindrops caught in a heavy wind. By the time flesh and sinew reformed itself over her face to muffle her scream, he'd already had her ensnared. It was like an anaconda coiling around its prey. The way those ropes of tendrilled, bubbling flesh entwined themselves around her, and Saladin's face emerged from those slivers of meat.
Little Miss Katie, isn't it? Must be my lucky day. Your mother is a busy woman, you know. My client lost every single little person he loved to that thirst of hers.
He was drawing something from his throat, some kind of black dagger, pulling it up like a sword swallower. I don't know. I leapt into action the moment he was occupied. Maybe all those horror movies paid off after all. If there was anything they taught me, it's that any creature built of constantly morphing flesh always had the same weakness. Fire. All it took from my desk was a half-empty can of deodorant and my dad's old lighter.
I plied my makeshift flamethrower to whatever part of that oozing, fleshy mass looked the most exposed, pink and vulnerable. The heat and size of the erupting flame surprised even myself. He squealed like a stuck pig through unnatural vocal cords, and a tendril of flesh batted me across the room like I was weightless. But it had worked. Whatever parts of him the flames had touched were left bubbling and frothing, gooey and viscous like melted wax. But as he thrashed and whined, Katie seized the moment and let out her tongue. No, not a tongue. It was a proboscis, a long black spiral tube, like you'd see on a butterfly. She tried to jab it into his neck, but he jerked his head at the last moment, and it ended up somewhere far worse. Pierced through his eye. I thought the formless flesh that was Saladin was terrifying enough, but it was more terrifying still to watch it fade away, to see that flesh turn pale and veins wither like dying vines over taut, throbbing muscles. I realized she was sucking his blood through that proboscis like it was a drinking straw, and whatever other life essence flowed through that thing that was once a man. In seconds, his eyes and cheeks sunk in his face, like he was aging decades. I could only imagine what that proboscis would do to an ordinary human like myself. She was an inexperienced hunter. Saladin, wailing now, managed to worm his way out of her grip before the job was done. He took off through the window, seeming to evaporate as he smashed through the glass, letting the wind carry off those droplets of meat in empty veins as he scattered himself to the breeze. And yet again, another horror had gone as quickly as it had come. Katie pounced on me. I'd cried out for a moment, assuming she'd meant to turn that proboscis on me. But instead she wrapped me in a hug.
Mr. Vermeil, you saved me. I know that we could trust you. You're the best teacher ever.
I hugged her back just as the headmistress and the hounds from security came kicking down the door and found an office covered in bubbling viscera. I told the headmistress everything. In retrospect, I was shockingly honest. She was just as stoic as always through most of it, but the mention of the word Saladin inspired a look of horror I'd never seen in her before.
Him? No. He couldn't have found us.
She whispered to herself, cupping a hand over her mouth. I'm laying in the infirmary now, being cared for by a nurse with a third eye and no interest in hiding it. That would have horrified me before. Now I just cracked a smile. For better or worse, I've picked my side. I'm sticking by these kids, even if it leads me straight into hell. Something just occurred to me. These last few nights have been the first in years I've gotten through stone sober. Having a few beers after work was just a matter of course, like taking medication before bed so you won't feel sick. If it was a particularly bad day, I'd end up overdoing it and condemn myself to wake up the next morning with a murderous hangover and the knowledge that yet another potentially productive afternoon slipped right through my fingers. But now, I feel focused, fulfilled, like I'm doing something that matters for the very first time. The headmistress has the place under lockdown, of course. Every window covered and sealed, multiple lanky security agents attending every class, gas occasionally flushed through the ventilation system. For a woman so emotionless, the slight perspiration on her brow was basically her equivalent to a nervous breakdown. And yet, of course, she demanded that her precious teaching schedule be maintained, through thick and thin. I didn't mind. I liked to think that I was helping keep the kids sane. Although, really, it was more like the other way around. I noticed the kids didn't bother to hide their less human features anymore. like Billy's arm stretching a macabre 17 feet to collect his graded papers from my desk, or Abigail climbing along the walls like a spider during recess. It made me smile somehow, like they were letting me in on a secret world most people would never get to see. I was just reading them a cute little book about how a human boy and a Wendigo learned to set aside their differences when the bell rang. And there she was at the door, ushering me with a finger.
So, who is this Saladin guy anyways?
I asked as she led me down the hall.
A hunter. Perhaps the most skilled we know of in the modern era, with a reputation for being capable of punching above his weight class, so to speak, she explained. We thought we had him occupied chasing false leads across Bangladesh. To think that he was here in America all along. That he was slowly narrowing in on our exact location all this time and we never knew.
She clenched a hand into a fist. For her, the equivalent to screaming in frustration.
Why did he decide to target me? Because you're the first fully human teacher this school has ever had,
she confessed.
You were an unprecedented experiment, even though it may introduce many risk factors such as this. I thought it would do good for the children to have experience with a regular, everyday human. And did you really choose me because I was a loner? Expendable?
She didn't hear that question, or maybe she just pretended not to hear it.
Saladin always pursues more covert means of achieving his ends. At first, he likes to take his quarry by surprise. But if that fails, as it now has, his plan B invariably involves some form of, well, overwhelming force.
She sighed.
But there is some good news, at least. Thanks to the efforts of you and Katie, he was forced to leave behind his weapon of choice.
From her sleeve, she produced that blade that Saladin had been pulling from his throat. The one that would have dealt Katie the killing blow, if I'd just been a second later. It was jagged and black, and looked primitive, but a bit dazzling with the scarlet streaks embedded into its surface.
What's so special about it? It's a blade of obsidian damascened with a glaiophotis. To put it simply, it can cut through anything.
I reached out to feel its shiny surface, but she jerked it away from me.
I would recommend you avoid it even so much as touching it. It may have deleterious effects on a regular human.
For some reason, I was reminded of Saladin's words.
When dealing with matters of the occult for long, there are two options. Sacrifice your life or your humanity. There is no third path.
I wondered briefly how Saladin was able to conceal that weapon inside of him without dealing any damage. Also, how in the hell did he shrink it through the vent? Just monster things, I suppose. We came upon a heavy iron door in some obscure corner of the school, and she set about unlocking multiple tiers of locks.
I apologize, Mr. Vermeil. I know you appreciate your autonomy, but I must insist that you remain within the complex for the duration of the lockdown,
she said.
That means staying in the dorms. The bunker down the mountainside. I'm sure you've noticed it.
Is this some sort of secret path?
The school's access tunnels provide secure routes to many places. But I must confess, while the school itself was made to provide a safe and welcoming front for human visitors, the tunnels were not. They were never intended for your kind.
She paused. Even she seemed the slightest bit nervous.
There are many dangers down there. So I must ask that you stay by my side and do exactly as I say, when I say it. Are we understood?
She didn't have to ask me twice. I immediately saw what she meant when she said those tunnels weren't designed for human use. They were horrifically claustrophobic labyrinths of concrete, to the point I sometimes had to bend down or angle myself sideways just to squeeze through. The must was suffocating. Hallways of seemingly random shapes and sizes jut out in every direction, and I had no idea how she'd memorized which to take. All it took was a single moment, a single instant's lapse in concentration, a single glance away as my clothes caught on a hunk of concrete, and she was gone. I'll be honest, I don't do well with cramped spaces, and when it fully sunk in that she had vanished, and I was alone down here in the dark, my first instinct was to crumple into a ball and start sobbing. Embarrassingly, I had to calm myself down in the exact same ways I calmed my students when they were having a tantrum. I talked through my feelings, took deep breaths, grounded myself.
You've been through so much worse than some tight hallways,
I thought.
Keep it together.
But every step forward was a Herculean effort, like I was knee-deep in sludge. All I had to light the way now was my little phone flashlight, and the darkness around me seemed to somehow be fighting back against the light and was rapidly taking territory. I'd venture forward down a hall, and it'd get tighter and tighter with every step. So I'd turn around, and somehow the same thing would happen on my way back. Was I losing my mind down here in the dark? Or were the walls really closing in on me, like I was about to be crushed by the peristaltic motions inside of some cyclopean creature? And every so often, I'd run into one of those shed skins, like I'd seen in the ditch outside the school all those days ago. They'd tangle around me like a spider's web, and I'd cry out as I thrashed to tear them off of me. On a closer look like this, they didn't seem reptilian in the slightest. They looked human. And then, down the hall, came a sound. I breathed a sigh of relief.
Oh, thank God.
I called out,
Headmistress, I'm right.
And then came another sound. The guttural crackling of a snarl rising from an unnatural throat, and I realized that I had just drawn the attention of something terrible. I bit my tongue to stifle a gasp. Mentally, I screamed at myself over how stupid I'd been. I tried to turn my flashlight off, but ended up dropping my phone and illuminating the entire hall. All I could do was back up as far as I could, press my back to the dead end, and await whatever was coming to me. Footsteps in the darkness, of a sort of hobbling, awkward gait. In the dim light, a silhouette came vaguely into view. It looked roughly the shape of a man, but the proportions were all wrong. The shapes. It was like a child's drawing of a human being. Too angular, too thin, and along that jagged form was a garden of tumorous growths. Hair and teeth and blind half-formed eyes poking from the malignant teratomas, cushioned in almost scrotal pockets of loose and wrinkled flesh. There was no head above its shoulders. Instead, there was a limp, swaying tube of flesh, and when it faced me, I could see down into the countless rows of teeth lining that esophageal tube like a lamprey eel. Some sort of black ichor drooled from that undulating tube as the creature stood where my phone had landed, creaking and groaning in place. Then the thing turned and shuffled back into the darkness. Of course, it was blind. It had just been investigating the last noise it heard. I thanked whatever gods may be and clung to my little corner for what felt like hours before finally working up the courage to retrieve my phone with a shaky hand and kept creeping down the halls. Another noise. My blood froze in my veins. But then the headmistress's face emerged from the dark and I almost cried from relief.
Oh, thank God. I lost you, and why didn't you warn me about the creature down here? That blind leech-looking thing, I demanded. I know you said it was dangerous, but I cannot believe you let something like that just go waltzing around down here.
And for the first time in my life, I saw the headmistress go pale.
We don't.
This time she kept a hand squeezed around my wrist as she practically sprinted down the halls. We came to an observation deck observing what looked like some sort of containment chamber. One of those security agents laid sprawled across the floor, split in two. The chamber below was littered with those shed skins, as well as chunks of other things I couldn't name. She looked down on the empty chamber with bewilderment.
The cancer, it's really out. Who would ever do this?
The cancer? Why is it called?
She swallowed her fear.
Because that's simply what it is. A walking cancer. Cells growing and dividing aimlessly, uselessly, limitlessly.
She gestured to herself.
From it, we grow these human skins we wear. Guide its ceaseless growth to build our new bodies, piece by piece.
Automatically, in accordance to some built-in schedule, a red light clicked on in the containment unit accompanied by an industrial wail. Chunks of red viscera dropped from a tube in the wall, and amid the meat, I swore I saw hands, feet, clothes.
You feed people to that thing?
She sighed as if my human emotions were an inconvenience.
The meat is recovered from cemeteries and morgues. Don't lose your composure now. We have to focus.
She laid out the situation. Every cancer wants to spread, wants to feed itself. It'll find a way out before long, and when it does, that won't exactly bode well for the people of our cozy little mountain town. Whoever did this disconnected all emergency switches down here, and we didn't have any signal. We couldn't go all the way back to gather reinforcements. We had to handle this now. On our way out, we found another one of those security agents, sat near one of the control consoles by the containment chamber security locks. This one I almost didn't recognize as human at first. A man-sized tumor had mostly consumed him, that hairy, throbbing mass bulging as we neared, as if sensing we were threats. Only one arm and his head poked free from the malignant growth. Eyes wide and yellow, mouth hanging open breathlessly. The headmistress stood over him, coldly.
It was you? You did this? May I ask why?
He croaked out a few words in a slow wheeze.
Saladin, he had my family.
She nodded without a word, and ended his life with the damascened blade dispassionately. I guess it was a mercy at that point. I felt helpless, unarmed like this. Being the bait was an unenviable position. God, I wish I could get my hands on that blade of hers. I was fighting a panic attack as we went creeping through those halls again, until the headmistress stopped us with a raise of her hand. I was confused for a moment, until I strained my ears. There it was, that wheezing, shuddering croak from down the hall. She gestured, I nodded, took a deep breath, and got into position. She hid around another corner as I braced myself, and clapped. The immediate roar from down the hall sent such chills through me that my legs almost gave out from underneath me. The thing came sprinting down the hall full force, drool flickering everywhere as its tube-like head flopped around with its movements. I closed my eyes and awaited the end. The headmistress popped out at just the right time, Seizing the moment, she struck her blade right through the thing's back, leaving it thrashing on the end of it like a field mouse impaled by a spade fork. With speed no human could match, she took chunks out of it, the sort of chunks that even it could not heal back. But it wasn't enough. With a swing of its long head, it batted her away, and when I stepped forward to help her, it impaled me through the chest with that writhing tube and stole my breath away. I was pale and shivering as I held my hands against my bleeding wound. This is it, I thought. This is how I die. The life that flashed before my eyes was dull and boring, but at least it got pretty interesting right at the end. But darkness didn't come creeping around the edges of my vision like I expected. Instead, I felt a tingling down below. I looked down at my chest and witnessed the wound closing. Wait, no, metastasizing. Bulging pustules of permeating tumors filled the gaps in my flesh, rife with patches of hairs and little chunks of teeth just as the creature itself had been. I screamed at the agony of it as the cancer cracked through my ribs and pushed my heart and lungs aside. And then those thin, bony hands settled on either side of my head and yanked it upwards with a strength that should be impossible to them. In a rational world, it would have ripped it off. Instead, I felt jolted high in the air and realized my neck had been extended a good few feet through sheer cancerous tissues. Like a character from some morbid cartoon, my head bobbed on its distended neck like a jack-in-the-box, and I was left staring down at my own body. Every single thing the creature did to me just created more of me to fill the wounds. Oh God, I thought. It won't even let me die. It was the very distant singing of birds down another hall that ultimately drew the beast's attention away. It visibly quivered as it realized it had found its way out. All we could do was watch as the thing tore off into the darkness, roaring to itself as if in triumph. I don't know how many hours have passed. I'm in the infirmary, now largely returned to normal. The three-eyed nurse seems bored, even as she treats me with medicines and surgeries no earthly doctor would ever recognize, reversing, slowly and by degrees, the impossible ways the beast had twisted and reshaped my body. I've at least regained some control of my physical faculties, but in the process, I've been exposed to whole new categories of pain. Types of agony I thought were impossible. Types I never would have had to know had I gotten a job at any other school in the world. But the poor headmistress in the bed next to me seems more miserable still. Shell-shocked, even. Her eyes sunken and haunted.
He'll be back.
I can hear her whisper.
He'll let the cancer gorge itself, grow and grow, and then he'll be back.
It started with the animals. Hunters noticed populations dwindling rapidly and inexplicably in our little patch of the enclave. Rumors spread of deers hobbling around riddled with tumors that burst from their backs, or splitting their faces in twain. One was said to have been rendered completely immobile, more tumor than deer. And then people began disappearing, homes broken into, signs of a struggle, toppled furniture painted red with blood, but with no other trace of the families which lived there. The Fed's cover-up job was as impressive as it was terrifying to see. Seeing how efficiently those men in black worked, the media blackout, the disappearances, the patrols through the night enforcing some unspoken curfew. It made me wonder what else they've covered up in the past to have become this experienced. But it was a huge pit for all those precious taxpayer dollars, and parents were withdrawing their kids from the program en masse. I couldn't deny it. The integration initiative was falling apart. The headmistress was a shell of a woman, hollowed out, eyes sunken, exhausted. I could only imagine how the feds must be screaming in her ear to get the situation handled now, or the truce is off. I saw her sat in her office with a glass of scotch she hadn't taken a single sip of, staring off into the middle distance.
What is that phrase you humans say? No good deed goes unpunished.
Her voice was hoarse and dry.
Once, I pulled down merchant ships into the depths of the Caribbean. Nothing mattered but my own hunger. For centuries, it was a simple life.
She finally took a swig of her scotch.
To be a thing of horror was easy. It was to be free and without worries. But now that I've chosen to live like this, to try to be kind, to try to sow peace between our peoples, look what has become of it. What has become of me.
I finally noticed what she was staring at. A photo on the wall of that familiar little boy with the dirty blonde hair. Elijah. I wanted to hold her hand and deliver some rousing speech about how doing the right thing is never easy. But, to be honest, I was thinking the same thing. What the hell am I doing here? I'm not cut out for any of this. I kept telling myself, today's the last day, I'm going to quit for sure. Tomorrow. And then I'd get something like what happened this morning, when Katie walked up to me clutching her favorite little plush butterfly.
You know, Mr. Vermeil, all this stuff with Saladin, it's all been really scary,
she said.
But you know what? Every time I'm in your classroom, stuff doesn't seem so scary anymore.
Is that so?
Uh-huh. Every time I'm scared, I just think about what you say to me.
She puffed out her chest and lowered her voice, trying her best to imitate me.
Katie, if you ever feel sad or scared, just remember, somebody out there cares about you.
And then I smiled, and we gave each other a fist bump. And as she ran off, I realized I could never quit this place. How could I? I had to walk into class yesterday with a cane, limping with every step in whatever fashion least aggravated the aching pain in my chest, where multiple shattered ribs had been restored by some arcane process. The tumors left a thick, bumpy ridge of scar tissue along my chest, and my neck was still far longer than it used to be. Looking in the mirror, I realized I barely even looked human. I tried not to think about it. Class had only just barely begun when the headmistress strutted in with a sudden energy to her step, her hands clasped together, and something I never thought I'd see on her face. A big, beaming grin. The kids were just as awed as I was as she replaced me at the head of the class.
I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Vermeil, but I think you'll agree that the announcement I have for you all justifies my intrusion. Ahem.
She cleared her throat.
My beloved pupils, it is with pleasure that I announce to you that the notorious hunter known as Saladin has finally been brought to justice.
In an instant, the classroom was alive with frantic whispers and sighs of relief, until the headmistress silenced them with a raise of her hand. Even I couldn't believe it. Everything we've been through, all that suffering and terror, it was all over? It almost seemed anticlimactic. I was so filled with relief, I had to dab my cheeks with a napkin to staunch the thread of tears. Apparently, the hunter had gotten too overconfident, tried to take out one of the kids while they were in the process of being withdrawn from the initiative, while surrounded by dozens of agents. Even he couldn't escape the wrath of Uncle Sam, and I almost pitied him for whatever's being done to him in some black site somewhere. The smiles spread through the classroom like a disease, and even I couldn't wipe the grin off my face. Our long shared nightmare was over. Everything would go back to whatever normal meant anyways.
I know it must have been driving you all crazy, being so cooped up inside all the time,
the headmistress said.
So I say we celebrate by getting some fresh air. What do you say?
The class's answer was unanimous. It wasn't until we were out in the halls that I started to get a weird feeling in the back of my mind. Where were all the security agents? Why did she waltz into my class in particular to announce the news instead of using the PA system? It all came to head when I realized she was leading us into those access tunnels.
Now, hold on. Wait a minute.
I suddenly froze in place.
You want us to go through there? Are you sure that's safe? Why not just...
Oh, come now, Mr. Vermeil. I'm just leading them to a particularly beautiful mountain view. Don't you think they've earned it?
She smiled at me again. I didn't like it. The headmistress never smiled. I felt I couldn't even steal a single gasp of air in those tunnels. My experience there was the most traumatic of my life, and just being in those tight halls made my heart pound. But it wasn't long before we'd all emerged out of one of those side entrances, dotted seemingly arbitrarily along the mountainsides as if they once connected to chambers since deemed obsolete. And I must admit, it was beautiful. I savored the sight of the flock of crows rallying around the long, shimmering beam that was a waterfall peeking out from the cliff face before us, visible even through that impermeable mountain fog, and the sound of the metal security door slamming shut behind us. I turned to see the headmistress's face pressed against the glass. No, not hers. Someone else's. Someone familiar. It made sense. If he could alter his physiology at will, surely he could imitate that of another person. Yet still, I was dumbstruck.
I didn't know you could do that.
I'm trying new things, Mr. Vermeil.
His voice rang clear even with the metal door between us.
You should feel proud, you know. It's not often I run into someone who forces me to innovate.
And then, from down the mountainside, that terrible roar. The gurgles and guttural creaks of something vibrating some great and malformed vocal cords. The crash of trees being knocked over as something tears down a forest path. I only caught glimpses of it beneath us, through that fog, the silhouette of a thing so weighed by mounds and stumps of oozing tissues that it's bent and hunchbacked, crawling on hands and knees like a newborn baby. Teratomas having grown from mere fingernails to entire arms, hands, limbs, and faces, which themselves were then consumed by tumors and left swollen with the throbbing spherical stromas of cancerous mass. And poking free from that anathema to all beauty was that tube-like head, that lamprey maw of teeth longer than our arms, and a throat that could swallow us all whole. It was heaving and letting out those deep, roaring groans as it pulled itself up the mountainside, like the taste of us was all that could quiet its writhing agonies. There were paths from our perch back up to the school proper, but they were steep. It wasn't quite a sheer climb, but it wasn't far from being one either. I wish I could say that I was the big, bad hero who shepherded all my students up the mountainside. In truth, they left me in the dust. Even average kids were impossibly swift and energetic, and these were no average kids. The class took off up the slope like it was trivial, while I huffed and panted and scrambled up the rocks behind them, Realizing all those days I'd skipped the gym would now be the death of me.
Mr. Vermeil, grab my hand!
Suddenly, an arm distended at least 20 feet lurched out at me from over the cliff face. Billy, I realized. I took his hand, and the grotesque arm retracted like a fishing line reeling in a catch, lifting me as if I was weightless. The school came into view, but that cancerous leviathan was outpacing us. Horror rocked me as I felt the very earth shake as it dug its limbs into the mountainside below, to use like climbing axes, bile spewing from its esophageal tube as it roared with an intransigent hunger. We weren't going to make it. It was too vast, too powerful. And there she was before us, the headmistress. Her face was one of grim determination as she faced down the beast pursuing us. She was clad only in a gold-seamed robe, and in one easy motion, she cast it aside and let it vanish with the wind. For a moment, I froze in horror as her skin began to crack and break like a porcelain doll. Then I noticed the tips of tendrils poking out from the cracks, something working its way free from beneath her flesh like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. And I remembered that terrible leviathan I had once seen in her shadow. We had just passed by her when her human body broke apart completely, and black tendrils as thick as tree stumps tore forth from all directions, as if glad to be finally freed from that prison of flesh and bone. I could not tell where it began and ended. I know only that it rivaled the cancer in sheer scale. I tried not to look at her true self, not the disguise she'd been donning. I kept my eyes forward, even as behind us came the great roaring of beasts and the shaking of the earth as the two colossi slammed into one another. I grabbed a shotgun off the corpse of a security agent as we re-entered the school, for all the good that would do. My students gawked at me in awe. They'd never seen me like this before.
There's supposed to be a safe room on the west wing. All we can do is wait it out while the headmistress handles that thing,
I commanded.
Go, now!
I followed along as they scrambled down the halls, although I made a detour, scrounging around through the headmistress's office and tucking something beneath my jacket before rejoining the kids. Students from the other classes, seeing the herd, would occasionally emerge from their hiding places and join them. Every child had been packed into the safe room when I heard another voice down the hall.
Wait! Mr. Vermeil! You forgot about me!
It was Abigail, rushing forth to join us. It was impossible. I'd kept a careful head count of every child, to ensure none were left behind. In an instant, I raised the shotgun and unloaded it in the face of the thing pretending to be Abigail.
You're not going to fool me twice.
The thing bent over backwards from the force of the gunshot, to the point the top of its head rested against the ground behind its feet. Then it sprung instantly back into a standing position, its flesh beginning to twist and meld, the cruel cackle of Saladin emerging from its bullet-shredded lips.
Maybe you really are smarter than I give you credit for, Vermeil.
I slammed the safe room's door shut behind me and stood there with my gun pointed at it. The kids all cowering behind me. There's a silence for a while, punctuated only by the building shuddering upon its foundation as the leviathans fought outside. Then came a slow, rhythmic tapping on the door.
All I have to do is wait you out, Vermeil,
came the voice.
Sooner or later, one of those kids with you is going to get hungry. And when they start getting desperate, you're going to look like a nice, juicy steak.
Why are you doing this?
I called.
Just for what? The money? I'm sure whatever they're paying you, the feds can quadruple it.
No, it's not about the money. I consider this more of a self-funding hobby clearing these creatures off the streets before they even have a chance to grow up and hurt anyone.
Don't act like you have the moral high ground here. Not after what you did to all those people. Feeding them to the cancer just to, what? Fuel your little crusade? Was that just collateral damage to you?
That seemed to actually tick him off.
Those deaths are on you, not me. You're the one who forced my hand. None of this would have happened if you just...
Leave them alone. They're just children.
They're monsters, Vermeil. Demons in human skin. They're designed to kill and devour people like you.
I don't care what they are. They're my kids, and I'm not letting you hurt a single one of them.
My heroics were interrupted, however, by what felt like a Category 5 earthquake rocking me off my feet. It seemed those titans outside had come crashing into the school amid their brawl, tendrils and cancerous limbs tearing into the very foundations. For a moment, it felt like the entire structure would crumble in on itself and crush us like bugs. It was only by the grace by whatever gods may be that only the other wing of the school was destroyed, although some blackened tentacle tore a hole right through the wall of the safe room. Everyone and everything in the room lay in a cluttered heap. When I managed the strength to arise, Saladin was standing over me, that big grin on his face. My students were quivering with fear. I knew that, with their strength, if they all attacked at once, they could tear him to pieces. But they were frozen in place. Because, in the end, human or not, they were just kids. Terrified children faced with a man who wanted to hurt them. They couldn't defend themselves. Someone had to step up and protect them.
Last chance, Vermeil,
he said.
You've proven yourself competent. I could use someone with your talents.
I didn't bother bantering. I just raised the shotgun and blew a baseball bat hole through his chest. It didn't even slow him down, of course. The wound healed almost as quickly as it came, but it did infuriate him, and he came stomping towards me. Good, I thought. Get closer. I need you closer. I managed to blow a few more holes in him before he smacked the shotgun out of my chest with one hand and curled his fingers around my neck with the other. I gasped and wheezed as he strangled me, lifted me off the ground as his grip on my throat tightened. Tears streamed down my face as my vision darkened.
Maybe you aren't that smart after all. What a shame, but maybe things are better this way. After all, you might be happier down there in hell, surrounded by all these demons you gave up your life protecting.
And then, that smug grin was wiped off his face by the feeling of something piercing through his chest. With an almost drunken stumble, he looked slowly down to see the damascened dagger driven right through his heart. I'd snuck it from the headmistress's office, tucked it in my jacket just in case I had the opportunity to end him with his own weapon. His grip relaxed, and I fell to the floor, gasping and wheezing and sucking down fresh air. A black ichor spouted from his heart, around the throbbing wound that even he, with his powers of the flesh, could not heal. He laid there, staring up at the ceiling, laughing to himself as if at the absurdity of it all.
Clever man,
he whispered.
Clever.
And then the children descended upon him, and the screaming began. I was still flickering in and out of consciousness when the kids crowded around me, concerned looks on their faces, when I finally found the strength to look down at myself. I almost fainted at what I saw. My flesh had been twisted, knotted, calcified upon my chest where I had hidden the blade beneath my jacket, forming a hard crust of thick flesh that ran down my arm, where the blade had merged with my hand. A sort of black mucormycosis oozed through cracks in callous flesh like groundwater in the Sahara. It was still changing, evolving like something was growing upon me.
I could tell I was being fundamentally changed, but I couldn't tell how or into what. A couple students hefted my arms over their shoulders and escorted my limp form through the smoldering wreckage that had once been our school. And in front of the building, surrounded by the mangled flesh that was once the cancer, was a creature so immense that she was half veiled in the fog. A half-formed amorphous mass of Stygian flesh and long black tendrils. A single blue eye the size of a building staring down at me from all that darkness. I couldn't help but smile and wave weakly at her. So this is what the headmistress had been hiding under her skin all along. Together we all watched the school burn, whatever sections still remained crumbling one by one as the fire smoldered. The children kept watch on me as my body reformed itself, bones and joints cracking and reforming painlessly but uncomfortably as my figure morphed. Katie sat by my side, watching the fire consume the place she'd spent the happiest years of her short life.
"It's not over,"
she said.
"We'll find somewhere new. Rebuild. Make a new school. Far away from here."
I frowned at that, imagining them finding somewhere new and leaving us all behind. But it was for the best.
"I'll miss you all,"
I whispered weakly. She tilted her head.
"What do you mean, Mr. Vermeil? You're coming with us."
My gaze drifted down to my reflection in a shard of broken glass on the pavement. My shifting, smoldering, twisted form. I looked monstrous. I looked unnatural. I looked inhuman.
"After all,"
she said with a smile,
"you're one of us now."